Captain Midnight.
When talking about Men in Black as a franchise, there's one stat that I think is pretty telling. This is the US domestic box office chart for every entry in the series, minus a re-release of the second one. It's also just a list of the movies in order, because each entry made less than the one before it, with the most recent film unable to crack $100 million, something the first one pulled off easily back in 1997. Unlike a franchise like John Wick or even Thor, they've never had excitement really grow over time to the point where a later movie will make more than the first. For whatever reason, Men in Black has never really recaptured the excitement of that first film, even as they've tried over and over again. Why is that? Well, this week I wanted to dig into it and talk about where Men in Black has succeeded and failed in its over 20-year history. I'll be honest, the YouTube algorithm sort of hates it when I cover old stuff, so you'd definitely be doing me a favor if you liked, subscribed, or just left a comment down below with your own take on the series. So with all that said, let's get into it.
MIB's Agent L, beauty, brains, and, well, you know. Catch Men in Black next weekend on Kids WB.
The first Men in Black film is kind of the result of a ton of 90s trends colliding with each other. The most obvious one being that decade's fascination with shadowy government agencies who are covering up the existence of aliens. The X-Files had started 4 years earlier, and kind of became the face of this fascination with extraterrestrials. These days, the Pentagon itself can put out unexplained UFO footage, and it feels like people barely take notice. But back then, it was kind of everywhere. Of course, including things like Independence Day, which Will Smith had starred in the year before. But there's another 90s trend that Men in Black is a part of that isn't quite so obvious. It actually only exists because of the huge comic book boom in the first part of the decade. The comic Men in Black was created by Lau Cunningham and published by Aerosol and later Malibu Comics in 1990. It was a very under-the-radar indie series, which followed the MIB agency as they battled not only aliens, but demons, vampires, zombies, and any other standard monster you can think of. It honestly bears very little resemblance to the movie, aside from the basic premise, the character names, and the neuralizer, the memory wiping device which the movies were smart enough to keep around, but used in a more comedic way. The appeal of that first film is very easy to see. In many ways, it's a live-action cartoon. It moves fast, it's filled with creative special effects, and crucially, it features Will Smith right as he was ascending to being the biggest actor in the world. Bad Boys, Independence Day, and Men in Black was the 3-movie run that really cemented him as a superstar, instead of as a rapping sitcom actor. And watching this first film, it's very easy to see why. The movie sets up a simple dynamic. Smith is Agent J, the young, hotshot cop recruit who is new to the world of aliens. And Tommy Lee Jones is the stern, seen-it-all old guy who plays the straight man to his antics. And you know what? It works. When you add the stars' strong personalities to some goofy but very fun and creative world building, you end up with a movie that really appealed to both kids and adults. I wouldn't say Men in Black was one of the very best films of the 90s, but I do think it's an example of the old blockbuster machine working at the height of its power. If the American Godzilla is 90s Hollywood at its excessive worst, Men in Black really shows what that same machine can do when firing on all cylinders. Unfortunately, they weren't able to recapture the magic in the sequel. I would say this second film was the last time an MIB movie coming out was a big deal. Now maybe that's just my perception of things. I was an excited 9-year-old when this came out, and I remember it being everywhere. The cartoon was constantly playing on Kids WB and was about to wrap up its 4-season run. And generally, I think people were just excited to see what the sequel had in store. But this one just isn't as strong. There's some stuff I like here, like all the winks and nods to low-budget 70s sci-fi, but neither the jokes or the villains really measure up. I think it also started this weird trend that continued to haunt the series. Like, when I think back on Men in Black, I think of it as a buddy comedy, an odd couple situation where you have these two guys playing off each other in fun ways. But the second and third film kind of seem hellbent on keeping Smith and Tommy Lee Jones far apart for a lot of their running time. I don't know if these two just like hate dealing with each other in real life, or if the director Barry Sonnenfeld felt they ran out of good material for the characters both together, but even though most of the sequels are sold on the two of them, there's really nothing these movies love doing more than splitting them up. Which is kind of weird because the end of the first one sets up that Jones doesn't need to come back at all when he retires and Agent L takes over as Jay's partner, only for her to be swiftly written out at the start of the second movie. So okay, maybe in the second one they just thought K not knowing who he used to be was a really fun idea, and one that made it worth them being on screen together a bit less. But after the first 20 minutes, the third film has Jones just kind of leave the movie entirely until the final scene or two. Instead, 2012's Men in Black 3 sees Smith's Agent J travel back in time to team up with a younger version of K, played by Josh Brolin. It's just so weird to me that this series was built around these two actors' dynamic, but it's a dynamic that the movies don't really know what to do with after that first film. But you know what? I do kind of like this one. More than the other sequels at least. The 2010s weren't really the best decade for Will Smith, so it was nice to see that he was still capable of that classic Will Smith performance, goofiness intact. The effects aren't great, even for 2012, which seems kind of crazy considering just how expensive this movie was. But there is a real cartoonish quality to the whole production that makes it feel like a movie from 2004 that just so happened to be made in 2012. It's not an amazing watch or anything, but it was a nice bounce back for the franchise, and for a while, it seemed like a decent send-off. Unfortunately, we weren't so lucky, as 2019 brought us the single worst entry into the series. Men in Black International is a movie that does not exist. Sure, you can look it up, you can Google the posters, you can even pay money to watch the thing. But the moment it's over, it is slipping out of your brain like that one monster in Doctor Who that makes you forget they were there unless you're actively looking at them. If Men in Black 1 shows us the 90s blockbuster at its most fun, International is an example of the 2010s franchise movie making at its most empty and cynical. The thought process here is pretty obvious. The studio had this franchise name sitting around, but they didn't want to spend the money to get Smith back, especially after the third one only did okay at the box office. So why not cast some younger, less expensive actors to take up the mantle and build out the Men in Black brand? Enter Chris Hemsworth and Tessa Thompson. And look, I don't have anything against these actors, I've found them really likable in a lot of things, but the characters here, they're just boring. You can kind of feel the movie trying to keep a similar dynamic as the old ones, but flipping the roles. This time, it's the new recruit, Agent M, who is really by the book and a little more strict, and the older mentor, Agent H, who gets to be the goofy one. Maybe that could have worked, even with these actors, but the tone and script of the movie really let them down. As I've said, the first three Men in Black movies really feel like a cartoon. There's a ton of visual comedy, lots of slapstick humor, and even Jones' strict Agent K is like the most over-the-top version of a straight man. He's not just serious, he's comically serious. International takes M a bit too seriously, like she devotes her life to being an MIB agent after seeing her parents mind wiped as a kid, and the whole movie kind of takes her hero's journey at face value. It tries to get away with the wonder and solemn awe that a movie like The Force Awakens has for the iconic imagery of the original Star Wars trilogy, but that feels completely at odds with what Men in Black was, a comedy. It never demanded that you take the worlds of the film very seriously. Yeah, I wonder if there's any movies out now that might suffer from that exact problem.
Ghostbusters, we're ready to believe you.
We're closed.
And while there is some slapstick alien humor in the movie for sure, everything feels much slower paced, with more static shots and less dynamic visual comedy. It kind of ends up feeling like a mediocre, improv-heavy sitcom that just so happens to have some really expensive effects in it. Whereas the first film used its budget well to build pretty elaborate comedy action set pieces. I think this film just never gets all that creative visually. It's also easily the longest in the series. That first film is barely over 90 minutes. It knows exactly the kind of fast-paced humor that it's going for, and it makes International feel so long in comparison. And obviously, humor is a really subjective thing, but I don't think I even so much as cracked a smile in this. It's just a movie that kind of felt dead on arrival.
May I have your attention, please?
This July, they're back in action and back in black.
So where does that leave Men in Black going forward? Well, who knows. For years there was buzz about a crossover movie with the Jump Street films, but that seems to have fizzled out. More recently though, there were rumors of just a traditional sequel, which would bring Smith and a now 75-year-old Tommy Lee Jones back. Personally, I'd be happy if they just left this one alone. The third movie isn't bad, but almost nothing after the first film has felt all that essential. At the end of the day, that first movie still towers above them all, and the villains especially have never come close to matching how creepy and fun Vincent D'Onofrio was. And just generally, Men in Black feels so rooted in the 90s that bringing them back over and over again starts to feel a little sad. It'd be nice if the film industry could look at the falling numbers and dwindling audience interest and see that they should just show some restraint here. But I'm sure the franchise will reappear in some shape or form again. Hopefully, at the very least, they'll be able to figure out why that first Men in Black movie works so much better than International did.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.